Thank you. Okay, now we're a fraction late because we're waiting for the people to all join in from the waiting room and to get settled in. I'll just introduce myself. My name's Julia Thornton. I'm the chair of Victorian Fabians, and it was Victorian Fabians who organised this event, even though it's now a national event. We're expecting, we'll see if they all join. But I would like to welcome you, for all of you. So I'll just sort of prolong my welcome a little bit to make sure that everybody's on before we actually get kick-started into the meeting proper. Okay, so yeah, I think I've said that this is a national event, but it was the brainchild of the Victorian branch. But one of the things that we are really excited about is the possibilities that have been offered by, you know, being forced, I guess, to use Zoom. This is only the second full-size Zoom event. It's our first national event. Our previous test with Zoom was just in Victoria. So the possibilities that it's opened up are just absolutely amazing. We're having huge meetings, the like of which we've never really seen before. And we're really pleased to be able to have two fabulous speakers as we've got tonight and be able to host them to such a large audience. So I hope in times of the coronavirus that you're all watching from a place of health and relative comfort, particularly given the present circumstances, and that you can just settle back and enjoy what we've got to present to you tonight. Lands that we're meeting on tonight, so I can't give my usual warranty welcome to acknowledgement of country. This is an acknowledgement of many First Nations. So I acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, as on whose lands we're meeting tonight, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community, and pay the respect to them, their cultures, and to elders both past and present. Now, one of the things we do when we have face-to-face meetings, of course, is we get people to sort of come in past the door, and we charge them, you know, a little, we ask them for a donation, we ask them to join up. So we haven't got a door, so we can't ask you to make a donation at the door. So instead, what we'll do is we'll ask you, if you're so minded, if you're so excited by our event, to pop across to the Fabians website and make a donation through there. And if you haven't joined up, please join up, because there'll be a lot more of this kind of meeting going on, even once the restrictions have lifted, because it's such a wonderful way of being able to get both to Australian regions, and even, as we found earlier, we had our AGM overseas. And in fact, I think even in our first meeting, we had somebody who was from Germany. So if you would like to make a donation or join up, that would be fabulous, because that's the only thing that keeps us afloat. We're not beholden to anybody except our members, which I think is a good thing, but it just means we do it in tiny amounts of money. I'll just move very rapidly over to introducing Jeff McCracken-Houston. Jeff's been behind the making of this series of events on generally on socialism in Australia, and he's done a fantastic job. And I'd like to hand over to him now, and you will need to unmute yourself, or be unmuted. Okay, Santino, can you unmute Jeff?
Yep.
He's still muted from what I can.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now.
Yes, that's right. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks, Julia, and welcome everyone, and a special welcome to our speakers tonight, John Quiggin and Frank Bongiorno. I think, as Julia has mentioned, this is the third event in our series on socialism, centrism, and the climate emergency. And just to let you know that after the formal meeting, you're all invited to get yourself a drink and some nibbles and join us in the online pub. And you will explain more about that when we get to it. Another thing, just to let you know, that as we've got such a large audience, the way we're going to be dealing with questions to our speakers is that we will take them via Zoom chat. Now, you can submit chat at any time, and we will attempt to pick out questioners who, where there's a theme emerging in the questions, and then we will go to someone who's asked a question on that theme. While our speakers are presenting, the chat will not be visible on screen because it's a bit like, you know, in your meeting, we don't want to distract from what speakers are saying, but your chats are coming through to the meeting host, and we are monitoring them, and we're looking for questions arising out of that. Now, in this event series, what really prompted this was the emergence in the USA and the UK of mass movements under the banner of socialism or democratic socialism. And we've asked ourselves whether we might see something similar here in Australia. We note that Australia faces many of the same issues as these other countries, though probably in a more muted form, and also that our progressive movement has very similar values. And in fact, of course, both the ALP and the Fabians were set up as democratic socialist organizations. And so we've asked ourselves, and we're asking in this series, has that socialism no relevance today, or is it actually now a time that we should revisit it? So in the first event, we asked, what is the idea of socialism? What might that idea mean in the advanced democracies today? And we asked if it is an idea that Australia needs in order to move on from the years of the neoliberal years. In event 2, we asked if a socialist approach was essential to respond effectively to the climate emergency. And in this final event, we asked the question whether the progressive movement here, whether it's now time for this movement to revisit its socialist roots, and if it did, what idea of socialism might emerge from that, and how much success might that idea have? Now, I think it's hard to think of anyone better to lead us through this debate than our speakers tonight. The first one we're going to hear from, we'll first hear from Professor John Quiggin. John is VC Senior Research Fellow in the School of Economics at the University of Queensland. He is prominent both as a research economist and as a commentator on Australian economic policy. In his recent book, Zombie Economics, John argued that a simple return to traditional Keynesian economics and the politics of the welfare state will not be enough either to kill dead ideas of neoliberalism or prevent future crises. So we very much look forward to John's views on the questions tonight. Thank you very much, John.
Okay, thank you. I'm unmuted, that's great. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting. And there's an awful lot I could talk about, but I wanted to start with the occurrence of this crisis and with the implications of this crisis for neoliberalism, market liberalism, the various ways in which we can describe the economic ideas and structures that have been dominant ever since the mid-1970s, coming into being following the crisis which led to the breakdown of the Keynesian social democratic period and the Bretton Woods system. So there's a temptation, I think, particularly among those who don't want to see change, to say, well, look, this is a 100-year pandemic, which is true. We should just try and get back as fast as we can to the status quo ante, to the way things were before. That's certainly a lot of the rhetoric that's coming out of the government, though I think it's fair to say with somewhat less conviction as time goes on. So I think it's important to realise that really the whole case for neoliberalism rests on the assumption that crises really shouldn't happen. It's based on an economic model in which the economy naturally tends to equilibrium, in which it rapidly and flexibly adjusts to shocks, including the kind of shock we're seeing now. But if you look at the history of the neoliberal period, it is simply full of these shocks and catastrophes. It's just 10 years or so now since the global financial crisis. In Australia's case, thanks to good economic management, we avoided most of the effects of that crisis, and so did a number of countries. China pursued much the same policies as we did, and therefore managed to avoid the crisis. And that was also, of course, helpful to us. But in most of the world, most of the developed world, it produced a recession which was barely ending by the time this crisis hit. 10 years before that, in much of the developed world, again, you had the internet bubble and boom, a bubble and bust, which again created vast amounts of wealth and then destroyed it. A few years before that, the Asian economic crisis, which again, with good management, Australia managed to be largely unaffected by. But going back to 1990, there was a global recession then, in which Australia, in the so-called recession we had to have, managed far worse than most other countries, had a very long period of severe recession. That was in some sense caused by a previous crisis, the stock market crash of 1987, the attempt to bail out the stock market, force central banks into pumping vast amounts of liquidity into the system. And when they tried to take it out, we had a crisis. Before that, there was the minerals boom and bust, also globally the second oil shock. So what we see is a situation where crisis is in fact not something exceptional that we shouldn't expect ever to happen, but something that happens as often as not. As often as not, the system is in crisis, and yet it has no real resources to cope with crisis. In every occasion, governments have had to step in, attempt to fix it, whether successfully or otherwise. And so, that's true of the whole history of capitalism, with the exception of the 30 years or so of Keynesian macroeconomic stability, which started during World War II, lasted with more or less success until the early 1970s, and then fell in a heap. Now, I think for those whose political views were formed at that time, for the majority, this was seen as a definitive refutation of the Keynesian era, that we had this terrible crisis when we've been used to stability, steady growth, full employment, and so forth. But in retrospect, and the advocates of neoliberalism promised a return to stability, claimed it had been delivered in the early 2000s in the so-called Great Moderation. But now, looking over 30 years, what we can see is this is completely illusory. It's crisis after crisis after crisis. In every crisis, what we see is governments coming in to bail out those who caused the crisis, and that in every case, it's working people and the population in general who bears the cost, and we see unemployment, inequality ratcheting up steadily over the course of these crises. And I think that's reflected, we talk about the movement towards socialism, that's reflected in the age distribution you see views, that people whose, particularly in policy circles, whose views were formed in late 1970s, still retain this visceral belief that free markets are the way to go. Those people are mostly passing from the scene in terms of active politics. People whose views were formed in the 80s and 90s more or less accepted this stuff as the established view, and as long as things went reasonably well, as they did for much of the 90s and early 2000s, stuck to it. Everybody who's come of age really since about 2000, all of the millennials and Generation Z have experienced none of these good things, have experienced the system as it actually is, and have therefore rejected it. So I think we're seeing that even among notional conservatives, people like Morrison and Frydenberg, they entered politics when things look reasonably good, but the vast majority of their experience has been the poor performance of neoliberalism. They haven't got the haven't got in their bones the kind of visceral belief in it that a previous generation of policymakers on both sides of politics had. And that's reflected in their willingness to throw dogma overboard, both for good reasons in the context of the crisis, but also, if we recall, the whole energy and climate debate. They're all perfectly happy to do things like build coal-fired power stations, which a previous generation of people, of Liberals, no matter how fanatical they were on climate denial, would have shuddered with horror, saying, "Well, whatever it is, we can't go and engage in public enterprise." So I think what we see is a complete loss of faith in the current order. I've often drawn the analogy of the communist bloc in the early 1980s. No one believed in it, but there didn't seem to be any way forward. They were waiting for some kind of crisis to happen, and of course, in due course, it did. So that's the situation we face. That this crisis has yet again shown up the uselessness of the reforms that we were undertaken with the idea of making everything lean and mean and efficient. It's striking indeed. Looking at Morrison is an interesting figure, somebody who doesn't have, I think, a very ideological position on anything, basically a marketing guy who sold getting back in the black as long as it went well in the focus groups, but I think has no deep commitment to that stuff. That, of course, he immediately said what we need is reform, and then thought about it and thought, I think, I'm maybe psychologising here, well, look, we've been saying this ever since we've been in government. Every time we've looked at the list of reforms, as they did with, say, the Shift and Dole report, they've been too hard. The only things we've been able to do is bash the unions and cut taxes for the rich. And it doesn't look as if bashing the unions ended up doing us much good. We needed them when the time came. All the stuff like promoting more casual employment turned out to give us grief once we tried to salvage the economy. I think he's still pretty much committed to keeping tax cuts for the rich. But when he looks at reform, having mouthed the right words, then he says, well, actually, what I want here is something new and different, not the same stuff that I've been hearing for years. So I think that's indicative of the fact that we're in a situation where nearly everybody at some level understands that what we've been doing hasn't been working, and that when a crisis comes along, suddenly everybody jumps back to the government and wants help, and that they haven't delivered the goods in any way in between times. And that's obvious in the kind of mild bank bashing that he's been doing. For example, the financial system was the cause of the last crisis and got bailed out on very generous terms. This time round, it was a failure in the sense that it failed to give us any warning that this was coming. If you follow this literature back to before the global financial crisis, there was a big buzz of enthusiasm about how financial markets would be able to predict. Indeed, literally, pandemics was one of the examples they chose, that by all the clever collection of information that the financial markets do, they will be able to indeed issue futures on pandemics, and these would alert us when they were coming. Of course, in reality, the stock market hit its peak on February the 21st, about the time that the average punter down at the pub realised that this virus might actually be a bit of a problem. And of course, the financial sector has been useless as a conduit for the various relief programs. The US small business loan, they got all the money and promptly handed it to their big business clients because that was the easiest thing to do with money from the government. Our scheme has similarly been problematic. We simply haven't had any of the benefits from these institutions that we're supposed to have. And furthermore, even the things where the market normally works well, it's clear that we're going to go through a period of radical readjustment in which leaving things to market forces isn't going to be adequate. I think we mentioned how brilliant Zoom has been. Now that people have used it, I doubt that I'm going to be getting that many invitations to fly to Melbourne to talk to Victorian Fabians when I can sit at home and talk to all the Fabians in the country. Multiply that across vast numbers of activity, and you suddenly think those hotels right next to airports where people fly from all over the country get together, 20 people in a room that can't possibly meet social distancing requirements, have their meeting and all fly home again, that just isn't going to happen anymore. And if that doesn't happen, there are huge implications, which we're already seeing, for commercial property, for aviation, for of course, for international tourism, for retail. All of these things are going to be radically changing in ways where the idea of the government's going to be able to say, well, look, you know, no one's getting sick anymore. We can just leave the market take its course, I think will be unsustainable. So what we're going to see is that the idea that in the end we have to rely on government action to make these adjustments work isn't going to go away when the number of cases of the virus goes to zero, as we hope it does. And that in turn means that there's a big opportunity to push for extension of the kind of the beneficial parts of the intervention we've seen. Of course, there'll be resistance, but looking at certainly the kind of policy program that I've been pushing, two of the core elements are a guaranteed minimum income, that is, as I would have put it before the crisis, increase all benefits back to the level of the old age pension, reverse the freezing of benefits that's been taking place for the last 30 years, and remove most of the conditionality and harassment of unemployed and disabled people that's been a hallmark of successive governments, particularly Conservative, but not only them, for the last 30 years. I certainly would never have imagined that benefits would be increased to a level higher than the old age pension, and that the government will give up completely, as far as I can tell, on trying to enforce these things in a matter of weeks. That's happened. And obviously, there's a strong basis for demand that even if they cut back benefits, they only cut them back to the level of the old age pension, and that they don't resume the nonsense of robo-debt, all the things that they were doing that were failing even before the crisis. The other element is a jobs guarantee, which is a commitment, in various forms, is a restoration of the commitment to full employment that governments until the mid-1990s had, at least officially. It was only I think, in the early years of the Howard government, the government explicitly said to the Reserve Bank, from now on, your job is keeping inflation. Your job is keeping inflation stable, although they do in fact still have a full employment listed in their objectives. The government, the federal government, as the government, now takes no responsibility for full employment. The Reserve Bank will manage the economy with a primary focus on inflation. Again, these are policies that were already failing in the wake of the global financial crisis. Inflation targeting was supposed to keep inflation between 2 and 4%, which was supposed to be enough to keep things going smoothly without any risk of a breakout. They've undershot that target for years on end. The Reserve Bank themselves were begging the government to undertake fiscal policy even before the crisis. So what we see is, I think, that the crisis has exposed the failures in this policy in ways that will make it very difficult to put it back together again. And the issue for socialists is to try and extract the maximum we can from the return to quasi-normal conditions that we can hope for. Some of it within the next 6 months, and the rest as hopefully the world discovers a vaccine and we can return to at least freedom of personal movement around the world. That's, we don't know when that will be, but and particularly how competent governments around the world will be in managing the mass administration of the vaccine. Certainly, looking at the experience of the US, it seems like many of our major sources of visitors won't get there for quite a long while, even given successful development of vaccine. So that's, I think, the two elements that, in terms of directive economic policy, that socialists should be pushing for. The second, which we've been discussing, which of course has been a big driver, is the climate emergency. And here I think there's a big chance to drive a wedge between the mainstream right and the leaders of climate denial, the Institute of Public Affairs, Centre for Independent Studies, commentators like Bolton and others. These are people who have been the most vocal in denying climate change, and almost uniformly also vocal in saying that the pandemic is non-existent, that the government shouldn't have done lockdown. They have discredited themselves in the public eye, and also, of course, been a major annoyance to Morrison and Frydenberg as they've tried to implement these policies. There is, I think, a chance to separate them out and to make a big push for a pivot from the government to say, as it turns out, there are things in life more important than bogus claims about cheap electricity. When we were faced with a real emergency right on our doorstep, we were prepared to undertake huge sacrifices. The fact that this other emergency has taken a little bit longer to arrive shouldn't lead you to continue with the kind of nonsense that was going on before the pandemic hit. And certainly you should disregard or think the opposite of anything that's said to you by any of the people who prove themselves to be both monsters in human terms and idiots in terms of their economic analysis, in terms of their analysis by their stance on the pandemic. So how far we can get with the government is unclear, but certainly there's room, I think, to separate a large section of conservative public opinion from the positions they've taken by pointing repeatedly at every possible opportunity to where the leaders of climate denial stood when it really mattered. Mattered in the short term, mattered to our lives. And certainly, any time I'm commenting on these people, that will be the first sentence. Andrew Bolt, who wanted to kill me and others because we're old enough to be expendable, says this. Any mention of those people is going to be accompanied by that. I think the other aspect of it, of course, the psychological support for denial has been very much based on the notion, we've heard all these terrible things are going to happen to us and they never do. Well, they certainly did do, and we can see that in a very big way. So that's, I think, the kinds of things I've been thinking about. Of course, everything is incredibly unpredictable. We don't know what will happen globally. I mean, I think we can be reasonably hopeful that the virus will be eliminated here, and as long as borders aren't reopened, things will stay that way. But if borders aren't reopened for years on end, as could be the case, that's going to be a very different situation to one where efforts to produce a vaccine bear fruit rapidly, and the immediate effects of the virus are over in a matter of a year or so. So I'll leave it there. I assume we're going straight to Frank, and then questions after that.
Yeah, that's right. That's correct, John.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was really, really fascinating analysis of what's happening today and what has led up to it over the years and has shaped people's opinion. So we're going to go in a moment to Frank. Just to remind everybody that the chat is open so that we can start putting together themes. Obviously, you'll need to respond also to Frank as he speaks. So as questions come into your mind, do put them in the chat, and we will pick them up after Frank has spoken. So next is my huge pleasure to welcome Frank Bongiorno. Frank is an outstanding expert on the Australian labour movement, on Australian politics and cultural history. He's a professor of history at the Australian National University, and he's been the head of the university's history department since 2018. He's written many books, and some that I can pick out are The People's Party, Victorian Labour and the Radical Tradition. Another is A Little History of the Australian Labour Party, and I think his most recent book is Elections Matter, 10 federal elections that shaped Australia. So welcome, Frank.
Great, thanks very much, Jeff, and thanks, John, too, for a stimulating talk. I'd like to begin too by acknowledging traditional owners of the land on which I'm sitting at the moment, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, as I do to Indigenous owners everywhere. I guess as with any sort of set of complicated and perplexing events, there are probably optimistic and pessimistic ways of looking at where we might go from here, of what it will be like on the other side, as people say ominously. I think, John's approach has been reassuring and optimistic in many ways, and I agree with much of what he's had to say. I guess when we engage in this kind of speculation about what happens next, we perhaps are often projecting our personalities. Do we have a kind of sunny or a dark disposition? Or we tend to be speculating on the basis of some kind of historical analogy, some sort of comparison with what has happened in the past, as John just did with a number of episodes such as the global financial crisis and some of those crises of the 1990s, the Asian financial crisis, the dot-com boom and bust, and so on. I suppose that's why a historian, I'm not an economist, I'm a historian, might have something useful to say at this kind of moment. But I'd offer the warning, I think history can offer us insight, but it can also be very misleading as well. And so what I want to do just for the next few minutes is to refer to three historical analogies or comparisons that I think have been quite common in recent weeks, and to see where they might take us. And the three I'm going to look at, and the analogy, of course, I'm talking about is with the COVID-19 crisis. The first of those is with the First World War and the Spanish influenza pandemic. The second is with the Great Depression of the 1930s, and the third is with the Second World War and post-war reconstruction. I'll just go through each of those just as a way of thinking about, the moment in which we find ourselves and where it might sit in a broader sweep of Australian and world history. I'll begin with World War I and the Spanish flu. In some ways, that's the most obvious, given that the crisis that we've faced in recent months has been at heart one of public health, as of course happened in 1918, 1919. I mean, by 1918, the First World War, had been devastating. It had killed millions of soldiers and civilians. But as American troops arrived on the Western Front that year, they brought with them a virulent strain of flu that, according to some recent estimates, eventually killed about 100 million people. Absolutely devastating. Now, so far as Australia was concerned, the first of its victims would, of course, have been soldiers far from home. As in 2020, Australia was in the fortunate position of having a fair bit of advance warning of what was on the way, and it imposed a maritime quarantine that probably minimised the damage. We did better in terms of death rates than New Zealand, for instance, better than South Africa. But Australia still lost probably somewhere between 13 and 20,000 people the illness. So many more, one hopes, than now seems likely from COVID-19. So I ask, is there anything in this experience that might point to the fate of progressive ideas or socialism on the other side of our pandemic? And my answer to that would be not much. Australia's gross domestic product had actually shrunk during the First World War, and it grew during the Spanish influenza epidemic or pandemic and straight afterwards. The flu, with its absenteeism, closures of some businesses in some places, there was state and border, as we've had today, border restrictions and port restrictions. All of this did disrupt economic activity, but in fact, much of life went on as before. The restrictions on people's movement, on their activities, these were much less severe than what we've been going through in recent months. The Victorian Football League, the predecessor of today's AFL, for instance, continued its season much as usual. Anzac Day outside Sydney went ahead pretty much as normal in 1919. So there was some disruption, but much less than we've seen. Neither the war nor the flu unleashed any burst, I think, of policy creativity among progressives at the time. The Labor Party, of course, did move leftward, adopting a socialisation objective in 1921, but the lean into war years were not years of great advance in social protection, you know, as distinct, I guess, from efforts to protect Australian urban and rural industry, which certainly did happen in the period. But, you know, Australian society was very divided, and we don't normally associate the 1920s and 1930s with socialist advance in Australia, certainly not the advance of socialist policy or progressive policy at any rate. And that sort of leads to one of the points I want to make tonight. It seems to me that, and I guess this does pick up a point that John made, progressive advance in Australia has generally emerged, I think, out of some kind of emerging policy consensus rather than really sharp contestation or sharp contention. And I think it's worth asking how much consensus we see emerging at present. Clearly some, and I guess for discussion might be, but how much and is it enough? So that's my first historical analogy. The second one is the Great Depression of the 1930s. Now, Australia's unemployment rate during the early 30s probably peaked at about 25%. And again, of course, the economy shrank. It's hardly surprising that pessimists in the present, as we clearly enter a period of economic crisis, would wonder if we're heading into a situation comparable with the Great Depression. My answer to that is that while we do have clearly tough times ahead, in fact, many are experiencing those tough times economically already, we should be careful about easy comparison. The macroeconomic capacity of the federal government was much weaker in 1930 than it is today. The monetary capacity of the central bank of the day, the Commonwealth Bank, was piddling compared with the kinds of activity that we've witnessed in just the last few weeks. Our welfare state has many deficiencies in 2020, but it was absolutely rudimentary in 1930. It lacked, for instance, an unemployment benefit, leaving aside a very basic system of insurance that had been set up in Queensland. Australians in 2020, I think, will demand and also receive more protection from their government than those of 90 years ago. So I think that is a difference that we need to keep a hold of. On the other hand, Australia's economy in 1930 was pretty simple, and ours isn't. Our economy isn't simple in the same way. You go back to that period, exports were dominated by wool and wheat and gold. A crisis for Australia to some extent arose out of a plunge in prices for commodities. Australia had been importing lots of capital in the form of public loans from London. There was a growing manufacturing sector developing behind a tariff wall. But few married women were engaged in paid work at that time. And those women who were involved in paid work were on the whole less affected by the downturn of 1930 because the industries in which they worked tended to be less vulnerable to the downturn than male-dominated industries. The household economy of that time usually comprised a man engaged in paid work and a woman in unpaid labour in the home. So in economic and social terms, I think we're talking about, in a lot of ways, a simpler set of arrangements. The unfolding economic crisis of the present is obviously really very different, but it's no less devastating, potentially, I think, for all that. Initially, at least, as we've seen, jobs in the services sector have proven extremely vulnerable to social distancing restrictions. And women, of course, now a much greater proportion of the workforce than back in 1930, are very well represented in the services sector and therefore very vulnerable to layoffs. Our export sector today, as I think John mentioned, it's dependent on services in a way that wasn't the case back in 1930. Education is not a very obvious example, but also tourism. Our economy is integrated and interconnected globally in more complex ways than back in 1930 through movements of people, capital and goods. The kind of restrictions on international travel, for instance, that John suggested might occur for some years, would be, I think, very damaging to many aspects of the Australian economy. In the 1930s, by way of contrast, Australia's economic recovery was shaped, even almost determined, really by the economic recovery going on in Britain at the same time. Australia had accepted many migrants in the 1920s, but I think I'd argue that immigration of recent years and the drying up of that places Australia in a very difficult situation. Clearly, many aspects of our economic growth and also I suspect our economic prosperity have depended on immigration flows that are going to be very disrupted in the time ahead. The Depression remains Australia's emblematic historical experience of both economic collapse and social distress, but I'm unsure whether it offers us too many clues about what the coming crisis is going to be like. At best, it might act as a reminder that progressive and socialist policies don't usually flourish in times of distress. I mean, I think a lot of us still have a kind of, perhaps crude Marxist idea in the back of our heads from reading years ago that says, when you have economic and social immiseration, that this is kind of a good thing for socialist advance. But I think there's a lot in our own Australian experience that suggests the exact opposite. I think in a lot of cases, economic periods of economic decay and social distress have actually provided a cover for conservative reaction. And that happened in the 1930s. And of course, it happened again in the 1970s. So let me go to the third and last of my historical comparisons, and that's with the Second World War and post-war reconstruction. I guess this is where the optimists come into their own. There have been frequent has been frequent drawing of parallels between our current circumstances and post-World War II reconstruction. And that, I think, remains our paradigmatic case of social reorganisation and perhaps also of socialist advance in Australia, the 1940s. Now, I don't want to pour cold water over such hopes, but I think it's also well to be cautious. Here are a few things that we might take from the experience of post-war reconstruction as we look at the other side of COVID. Firstly, it began early, years before the Second World War ended, and it was intimately connected to the Allies' articulation of war aim. In other words, it was connected to wartime propaganda and morale. I've seen few indications yet of our government, or indeed other governments around the world, seeking to raise the hopes and expectations of the population of any kind of new world order when we come out of this. On the contrary, our own federal government, as John said, with its talk of snapback, has made it plain that as far as possible, it will promote a return to business as usual. Now, it may not be able to do that, of course, but it's pretty clear that that would be something like a preferred position for a lot of our political masters. Now, the hope of progressives and socialists, of course, would be that that proves impossible, as well it might. Secondly, as Stuart McIntyre's study of Australian post-war reconstruction vividly shows, decisions made, commitments made long before the end of the war, particularly by Labor governments, were critical in shaping and in some ways limiting the possibilities of post-war reconstruction. For instance, if Labor had used the crisis of 1942 to push harder for more constitutional powers to be handed over to it, post-war governments would have had far fewer constraints in delivering what they wanted to deliver to the Australian public. Our federal government at the moment is making a lot of decisions right now that not only reflect its long-standing ideological preferences, but decisions that may well be hard to undo later. I mean, just today, it's proposing some kind of massive handout to private schools. At the same time, it seems to be using the crisis to shrink the higher education sector even more drastically than I think is likely to occur anyway. And again, we can see that as a kind of long-term ideological preference on that side of politics, born of a conviction that too many Australians are attending university, wasting resources and all the rest of it. I think we can expect much more of this kind of thing, some of which may well be nothing more complicated than the usual kinds of coteries of coalition friends and donors, consultants and others are using the cover of a crisis to try and loot Treasury in the usual kinds of ways. But certainly something we need to be really attentive about. Thirdly, on post-war reconstruction, unlike during and after the Second World War, I see little or no evidence at this stage of an emerging policy consensus. Now, I may be wrong about that, but it seems that is when we're most likely to get some sort of progressive attempts. It's when ideas, that have been championed by socialists, by progressives, are taken up more broadly. Now, it may well be that some of the spending, massive spending that we're seeing at the moment is an example of that. We'll have to really see what the government intends in terms of policy afterwards about public debt in particular. Keynesianism emerged as the basis of government macroeconomic policy in Australia in the 1940s, but it's striking that it actually first emerged under the Menzies government. I mean, the first Keynesian budget in Australia was really the first war budget in November 1939. Child endowment, which was in some ways the first instalment of a renovated welfare state, came before Labor got to office, again, came from the Menzies government. So Australia's renovated economic policy, welfare state, I'd argue, were forged more in consensus, underpinned by new economic stability and emerging prosperity, not against a background of serious contention or disagreement. And these changes were based in large part on recognition that the mass suffering of the Depression had to be avoided at virtually all costs. That the war had shown that government actually had the instruments to ensure that ordinary people would not be blown away by every economic crisis, by the prevailing economic winds, that government could do something about it. Now, it may be that we're entering into another period of that kind now, but I think it's probably still too early to tell. I'd like to believe these conditions currently exist, but I see a lot of evidence to the contrary. I see conservative politicians gearing up to use the level of debt that we're likely to take out of this crisis as a cover for reaction, for business tax cuts, for more assaults on unions and deregulation of industrial relations, for cuts to the public sector, for a winding back of so-called red tape and green tape and all the rest of it. Reading Malcolm Turnbull's memoir, which I've been doing in recent days, I think is a good reminder of how things like business tax cuts are basically an article of faith, even for those who call themselves liberal moderates. And so, I think we can see a lot of activity around, a lot of debate and disagreement around that. There are other parallels with the 1940s that are other than reassuring. Many of the policies of the Labor governments of the 40s ran into a rhetoric from the new Liberal Party under Menzies that appealed to people's desire to restore the status quo ante, to return to a pre-war order. You might think this is bizarre. Why would anyone want to return to the Depression of the 1930s? But that kind of nostalgia has an enormous appeal, to think of the period before the war, things were simpler back then. We may well run into those kinds of ideas again, particularly in the context of, restrictions on social movement, a whole range of lifestyle patterns that are going to be very different from what most of us would treat as normal. So when Liberals complained of socialist regimentation or the rest in the 40s, I think, in many ways they prefigure the kinds of complaints that we've been hearing in recent times about excessive, interference in our lives and the supposedly unnecessary nature of the restrictions. That kind of appeal is not going to go away, and as socialists and progressives, we need to be able to deal with it. But to finish up, this isn't a counsel of despair. It's rather a warning that I think if we want progressive policy, if we want a more equal and a fairer society, it's not going to fall into our laps compliments of coronavirus. Clearly, some very good things have come of what has been a dreadful tragedy. Some welfare payments, especially for the unemployed, have been increased in ways that, as John said, was unimaginable just a few weeks ago. Governments have been forced to recognise that markets of the neoliberal imagination are hopeless in responding to grown-up problems, to adult problems, something that should have been clear after 2008. But of course, the message became garbled, particularly in Australia, perhaps because we did come out of that crisis rather better than most other countries. The unions, of course, have been consulted and listened to by Conservative governments. And as John said, the right-wing climate-denying commentariat is not being listened to. And that's also a very good thing for the future. Perhaps most importantly, I think we're probably seeing, and I think there may even be some polling out there already, we're seeing rising public trust in government. I can't emphasise enough how important for the centre-left, for Social Democrats, for Progressives, for Socialists, rising public trust is. We depend on it because we believe in evidence-based policy. If people are disaffected, if they don't trust politicians, if they don't trust government, we're always going to be in trouble. If they do, there's hope for us and hope that we can actually cut through. So the federal government today, I think, has a deep and principled commitment to inequality, and no crisis is going to cure it of that anytime soon. It's backed by business that I suspect would like nothing better than to be offered a few free kicks at a time when many industries are going to be struggling for profitability, and they'll look for relief from the tax office, which meant for you and me, well as, of course, from their own workforce, with lower wages and all the rest of it. Australia's commercial media has never been better geared for giving Conservative government and business what they want. We've seen that repeatedly in recent years. So while most kinds of business as usual are still a long way off, the familiar patterns of politics will probably be with us again fairly soon. And that could well be ugly. And as progressives and socialists, we need to be ready for it. Thank you.
Another fascinating account and some really fascinating insights there with those historical comparisons. So we're now moving to the question answer, and from now on chats are going to be visible. So all of you that have been sending in messages up till now, they've just been private to the host, so we don't distract, but from now on they will be visible. And I'd like to invite someone to kick this off who's submitted a question, and I'd like to invite Anthony Harris to ask your question. Anthony, can you unmute and make sure your video's on?
Okay, I'll try and do all that.
We can hear you, I think.
Yeah, you can hear me. I just don't know if the video is operating. Let's see if oh, there we go. And the dog's trying to track me. I'm sorry. And so the question really was around the idea that I think it's already been mentioned. There will be a perception that we paid all this money to maintain incomes and to do what we've done in this period, and so the rhetoric will be this has to be paid back in some way. So I'm wondering what people think about how that will translate into issues around debt into the future, who we think will have to pay for this, and how an issue of, for the left, how that issue of justice can translate into an active policy. So clearly it could go on debt, it could go on current taxation. There'll be arguments it's about this generation, the next generation, about tax of business, as you've said, or tax on wages. So I'm just wondering what how you think that will translate into the future, and what the rhetoric from us would have to be.
I'll start, I guess. But yeah, I will. But I think in this context, the World War II analogy is important, because we came out of World War II with a vast amount of debt, and of course the rhetoric during the Depression from Treasury and NEMA and so forth was debt's this big problem and we have to repay them. And roughly speaking, precisely because we had got used to the idea of governments doing lots of things, that rhetoric wasn't nearly as powerful, and because we had strong nominal growth, the debt fell away. The interest rates were low. The result was that without any big effort, the debt fell to a small fraction of GDP. It was never repaid. Some of it, I believe, is still there even. So that's the objective reality: is that governments are borrowing at almost zero. If we can get income growing at say 7% a year, which is 4% inflation and 3% GDP, in 10 years' time the debt will be half what it was. In 20 years' time, a quarter of what it was relative to income. As regards to the rhetoric, I mean, I suppose I'm a permanent optimist. We've seen Wayne Swan 4 or 5 times say we're going to be back in the black and we're paying down the debt. We've seen Morrison say it. We've seen Frydenberg say it. At some, I just think it's that tune. It certainly still played significantly in the last election with Clive Palmer. I think pushed it hard. I think people are just not going to listen to that talk, having seen how rapidly and necessarily it's thrown overboard. I don't think it's going to be. The government may try and snap back in some respects, but to say, "Oh, we have this terrible debt, and we have to do something about it," I think won't work. And the further reason is, of course, that that they ran the debt up themselves. If they used to be able to say, "Oh, it was really Labor's debt," so I guess I'm optimistic. I think that line of argument is just not going to work well.
Frank, do you want to comment on that?
I probably don't have much to add. I mean, I think I'd point to the very important point John made earlier, actually, about intergenerational injustice, which we've seen a lot of in recent years. That those younger people who have been locked out of I guess job security, of home ownership, and so on. And I think any government coming out of this crisis to impose a higher burden on that generation in the form of higher taxation, for instance, or it could be higher tuition fees at university. I think the politics of that could well be impossible, and I think that's a cause for optimism, really. Its basis, of course, is the dreadful fact that I think that particular generation has been so badly treated already. I think that the instincts, I think, of a conservative government would be to look in that kind of direction, and I think that I suspect the politics of it will be impossible, and that's a very good thing.
Thank you very much, Frank. I'd like to invite Ben, who I think has a question about a jobs guarantee. Are you there, Ben? Can you unmute? Make sure your video's on and ask your question. Do we have Ben?
Just one moment, Jeff. I'm just trying to find them. What was the name that I'm searching? Sorry.
Ben was the name that I had.
Yep, Ben. I will.
All right, can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah, Ben.
Okay.
Go ahead, Ben. Yep.
Thank you very much, speakers, for speaking. It's been great listening. John, I've just got a question for you. Can you please provide more details on how a jobs guarantee works?
Well, I mean, there are various versions of it. I mean, the first point is simply governments taking responsibility for full employment. So that's, if we look at the post-war period when we had full employment, there was no specific scheme called the jobs guarantee. It was just accepted that the primary objective of policy was to maintain full employment. So in periods as this started breaking down, we tried a bunch of things, including wage subsidies, which of course JobKeeper currently is. So that would be the obvious place to start in many respects. Also public sector job creation, but largely crippled by the idea that the jobs couldn't do anything that would be done by a permanent employee, which meant that they really couldn't do anything useful. So I'd see a combination of a substantially expanded public sector, which is what John Langmore and I argued for in Work for All 25 years ago, focusing on the kinds of frontline activities that have come to the fore in the context of the crisis. You know, more nurses' aid, more teachers' aides, more nurses and teachers, across a whole range of activities of that kind that actually generate a more employment-intensive economy, but backed up by a commitment to implement and maintain programs like Working Nation, the response to the 1990s recession, which briefly had significant effects and then was wound back and out of existence. So I don't think we want to be prescriptive about what form the policy takes. The crucial point is for the federal government to say full employment is the responsibility of the government. We restore the situation where, as before the 1990s, the Treasury and the Reserve Bank act in concert rather than as we have had, the Reserve Bank acting as a check, where if the Treasury gets too live, the Reserve Bank says, well, we'll just raise interest rates to cancel it out. That's, I think, a failed policy program. And so part of the story would be both changing the objectives of the Reserve Bank to focus on nominal growth and requiring, as in the past, that we have a coherent government policy rather than a fully independent central bank.
Thanks. Frank, do you have...
No, that's fine. It was one for John.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So I think we have a question from Tim Dimon about state intrusion into personal life, sort of arising out of experience recently. Would you like to ask your question, Tim?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, look, I'll try and keep it quick. Yeah, look, we're currently accepting on medical grounds that the state can tell us, you know, even how far apart we should stand when we're physically located. You know, we can only have a certain number of people meeting and all of those sorts of things. And I'm not trying to dispute that those things are necessary to sort of address a pandemic situation. But the concern is that sort of now the state has license to intrude into our personal life. To what extent do we sort of want it to pull back? And when people raise those concerns and raise those concerns genuinely and not sort of in the Andrew Bolt kind of a way, is there a socialist or a progressive response that takes those concerns seriously?
You want to go first, Frank?
Yeah, perhaps I will this time. Look, within the socialist tradition, of course, there are both statist and libertarian strands, and indeed many others as well. And I don't think, as socialists, we should be embarrassed about those libertarian strands. There is a place for them. The place for those may not be in the middle of a pandemic, although even there, you know, I think all of us instinctively, you know, do have views about places where government should and shouldn't tread. I think this will be an issue. I think you know, in a sense, there is a parallel with the Second World War, where you know, during that war, a government, federal government, armed with authority under the defence power and the Constitution, was able to, you know, to intervene in the lives of Australians in ways that instinctively many Australians disliked, and they did go overboard. People paid for it with, you know, being interned when, you know, they should not have justly been interned in some instances, dissident religious and political groups. We always need to be careful, and I think that is an aspect of the tradition on the left that we shouldn't be shy about, and there may well be a place for it as, you know, we come out of this crisis. I mean, my own position on government generally is, you know, to be suspicious, I think, of excessive interference in our private and personal lives. So to that extent, I do have, you know, liberal or libertarian views, and I think there is a respectable place for that within the socialist tradition.
I'll maybe toss in a couple of things. I mean, the first is, I think that the most intrusive stuff, I think, will be gone fast enough that it won't have a very long-lasting impact. I think get the limits. I'd be very surprised if by the end of May there were significant limits on groups of friends getting together, for example. But I think, I mean, a question was raised, and I think it's a serious one. If we're prepared to take this kind of intervention to deal with the pandemic, should we be more restrictive of smoking, for example? Should we say, as various people are opposed, the smoking age should be raised, legal age should be raised a year every year, so that essentially anyone currently under 18 is never legally allowed to smoke? You could make, that's I think the kind of issue where this question is likely to come up. And of course, I think, the other thing I think is, to the government's credit, with the COVID Act, they seem to have said, this time what we want is 100% take up and no trouble. They haven't let the police and people like that, all the people who wanted access to my health record, who wanted data matching, all the people who were keen on data matching have been told fairly thoroughly to keep out. I mean, they have let Amazon get the contract, which is pretty dubious, but I think the robo-debt fiasco has led them to be much more concerned about making this work and getting public support than they would have in the absence of those concerns.
Thanks very much. I'd like to next to invite Kate Cooper, who's raised the question of, I think, about how do we convince people or the government about the failure of neoliberalism. I don't know if that's what you're asking, Kate, but would you like to unmute and ask your question? Kate Cooper.
And I'll unmute myself. There we go. Hi.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it's all very well to have these wonderful ideas of, what to do and how to do it and everything, but how do we actually convince the government that that's the path that we need to take? I mean, they have their own agenda, looking after big corporations, fossil fuel companies. So what's the best way to approach convincing them that they're on the wrong track and that they need to adjust their thinking?
Do you want to try that first, Frank?
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose my brief answer would be we have to engage in politics. At the moment, we're in this kind of half-light, I suppose, aren't we, in which, we clearly have politics because we always have politics. But we don't have politics as usual. As I said at the end of my talk, the patterns of normal political life haven't resumed. There's levels of bipartisanship around dealing with the coronavirus that is relatively unusual in most of the public policy issues that we face in this country. But that's going to end. That will come to an end pretty soon. And everyone who is interested in shaping the future of the country is going to have to engage in politics in all of its forms. For some people, that will be through particular political parties. For others, it will be through their writing. For others, it'll be through street protest, all of those kinds of things. So, we will be resuming, I think, probably all pretty normal levels of political contention soon, and we need to be ready for that.
Yeah, by comment, we haven't mentioned the Labor Party so far, hardly, but I think the news there is very good. After the loss in last year, although as is usually the case, narrow election outcomes are seen as decisive rendering the electorate verdict. So there's a huge upsurge from the Labor right to say what we need to do is get in line with the conservatism of the electorate, and quite quickly that's disappeared. Jim Chalmers, I missed his talk, unfortunately, talking at the Australia Institute, denouncing neoliberalism by name. Now, of course, it's a very squishy concept in some ways. You can put what you like into it, but the fact that he feels emboldened to do that is striking. I mean, looking at Albanese I saw him say recently, a really dumb idea to legislate tax cuts 5 years in advance. Well, 6 months ago, he was waving them through the parliament because his advisors were saying, well, let's just not pick a fight on this one. So the first point is, I think Labor has shaken off the impact of the election defeat and is back to, and younger people in the Labor movement, including politics, don't have any great nostalgia for the great years of Hawke and Keating and neoliberal reform. They can see the situation. And what that means, I think, is the government isn't going to have the compliant opposition it had for its first year. Its first year after the election, or its first 8 months before the bushfire crisis, I guess. Second point, as I say, is an obvious question: is whether the Bolts and Joneses can reconnect with the government after having trashed them so thoroughly. That's the potential to split them off is important, because they're the ones who really believe this stuff, or at least are prepared to fight a cultural war on it. I mean, looking at, if I was being Morrison's life coach, I'd be sort of saying, look, you're at 70% popularity, you're not going to stay at 70% with a coalition at 50%. If you just do what all the people in the coalition want to, this is your chance to cement your place in history and be the guy who brought the nation together. I mean, he won't do that clearly if all he does is say, okay, it's back to what the LNP was pursuing. And I think he has been very equivocal about it. So I think that's part of the politics, I think, which implies, and Frank was making this point about consensus, implies a less partisan approach as much as possible. I mean, one thing I've been depressed to see in both the US and Australia is vaguely left commentators saying, oh, look, this is a disaster. The government's doing exactly what Labor and the Democrats said they should do. How can we win an election if the government does what we want? I mean, of course, they haven't done it exactly right, but the whole point was, seeing things in terms of a football team analogy, just as if they stole our playbook, when the whole point is the opposite of that.
Thank you very much. We've had a lot of questions around government spending and also linking that up with modern monetary theory. So just picking someone who's asked that, Nick Clift, if you'd like to ask your question. Nick Clift, if you could unmute and...
I don't know if Nick is still in the chat. I'm trying to have a look for him, but it doesn't seem that he's still around here. But I think the nuts and the question might have been there anyway for Frank and John about, perceptions of debt and monetary theory, if you want to give your thoughts.
Well, I mean, I get this all the time. So what I'd say is it's in many ways less confusing to think about this in real terms, because despite the name, modern monetary theory isn't really a monetary theory, at least understood properly. It basically says when we look at government fiscal policy, we shouldn't be worrying about deficit and debt. We should be worrying about the core and real resources in the economy. If that's too low, we have a depression. If it's too high, we have inflation. And so the purpose of the government's fiscal policy is to fill whatever gap there is in the balance between our productive capacity and what's actually being demanded. And the purpose of taxes is precisely to transfer demand away from consumers, away from households, to government, in order that we don't get excessive demand and therefore inflation. So what that says, that's, if we go back to the period, most of the period when modern monetary theory has been popular in most of the countries like the US, what that says is there's a huge amount of unemployed capacity out there. In these circumstances, worrying about the deficit makes no sense. This is, roughly speaking, because modern monetary theory, properly understood, is just a different way of presenting old-fashioned Keynesianism. This is basically the Keynesian liquidity trap. The current situation is much more complicated, in the sense that we have lost a huge slab of productive capacity. all the people who were making, serving meals in restaurants, working in shops, can no longer do that work. So what we've done is, rather than say, well, those people will have to, since they have no income, they'll also consume nothing, we've given them lots of money by historical standards so that they can maintain their living standards. The only reason that works is because the households who are in work can't spend their money on the things they used to spend it on, and haven't diverted it to other things in the way that they would, so that we have so far more or less a balance of supply and demand. Now, if we get a recovery 2 or 3 years down the track, this is the situation where modern monetary theory calls for taxes not to balance the budget or worry about debt, but to ensure that we don't have an excess of demand over supply, and that's particularly true if we introduce, as both I and modern monetary theory advocates support, a jobs guarantee. Once we have full employment, by definition, there aren't any additional resources to be brought into employment. So every additional dollar that the government spends has to be taken from the private sector, not on considerations of budget balance, but because if we want $1 worth of stuff for the government, that dollar has to be taken from the private sector. So I think, unfortunately, lots of people understand MMT to mean, look, we can just spend what we like and the bill will never come in. The bill comes in terms of saying the economy can't supply the government with what it wants to spend, and in addition, leave the level of private consumption unchanged.
Thanks. Did you want to talk about this at all?
I'm for it, definitely for the economists that way.
Yes. Right. So here's I think we have a question from Melba about millennials in the Labour Party. Is Melba? Can Melba?
Yes.
Unmute. Thank you.
I'm here. I'm here.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree fully with Frank and John about using all forms of actions so that we can change the political space that we are working on. And I am very much involved with millennials in the Labour Party. And might I tell you, a lot of them are really getting disappointed with the lack of democratic processes and with the presence of key power brokers. I don't have an answer to that. I'm trying hard to mentor them as much as I can, and also participating myself, knowing that I'm a bit of a I've come into the Labour Party, participating actively quite late in life, but yeah, I don't know. I agree with everything. We have to actually continue on with our socialist agenda, and I'm happy that during this COVID crisis, I'm able to attend the Fabians forums like this. However, I tell you, the space is available for people who think differently and who would like to see genuine, socialist agenda pushed on. I'm part of those who are getting disappointed, along with many millennials from culturally diverse backgrounds as well. I guess that's a comment.
Yeah.
And the question as well, how can we change things? I feel like we're in a bog.
Yeah, I think they're really good comments, and there was nothing at all there that I would disagree with at all. I think we've had a period over certainly the last decade, perhaps longer. Certainly since the global financial crisis, in which our economic system is not delivering, particularly for younger people. And we haven't, as a society, found a way out of that policy problem, that political problem, at this stage. I mean, I was involved about 2 years ago now in a surveying exercise with a social research company and a colleague down in Melbourne, Darren Penney, and we actually asked different generations of Australians, about the most significant events in their lifetimes, and go right back to the oldest generations, and not surprisingly, they had World War II at number one. But what was really striking was the global financial crisis was right up there for those younger generations. And I think that, is an indication of how, particularly the millennials really, and I think that indicated, just how much that looms as a conditioning event in their life. Indeed, an event that I suspect many older generations don't actually even recognise as a historical event, because it hasn't affected them in the same kind of way. And yeah, I mean, the last election, I think, must have been particularly disappointing, I think, for those of that generation, or those generations who, were looking for some relief, who were looking for a better deal than they've been getting. And yeah, I hope that, some of the things John says are right about, some of the possibilities coming out of this, that we'll be able to revisit some of these kinds of issues that were kind of closed down, I think, in the aftermath of the last election, but actually need to be reopened. And one of them is very much around, what this society can deliver for different generations, and particularly for those younger people that you were talking about, Melba.
Just to comment, I spent my entire adult life being disappointed in the Labor Party, and Frank's a historian, I'm sure would be able to point out that disappointment in the Labor Party has started, I'm sure, the day after it was founded and has continued ever since. That said, it's achieved a lot of good things over that time, even if it's always managed never to quite deliver what we might have hoped. So I suppose I wouldn't despair. I think we're not going to ever get everything we want out of politics in general or political parties, but I think we are seeing some positive signs. I think had Labor won the last election, we would have seen very good things, and I think that thinking, now that the shock of that defeat has worn off, I think we will see more of that kind of thing in the future.
Thanks very much. And I've got a question from Michael about the sort of fundamental questions that we're asking in this series. Michael, can you unmute and ask your question?
Okay, yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah. I guess I'm just curious because where can Australian socialism get their motivation to go forward and actually make a difference? All these other complications that we're talking about, yes, that's where we are in place and time right now. But who can we look up to, or who can we learn from, which will allow us to take the best pieces of socialism for Australia to actually grow as a nation as well in itself?
You want to start, Frank?
Yeah, I probably could say. I think it's a good question. Look, I think that it's reasonable for. I mean, I talked about historical comparison and analogy and what I had to say, and I think when we look at the possibilities of the present and the future, I think it's sensible to actually, to look back and see what's been achieved in the past, how it was achieved, what kinds of strategies and tactics have been deployed in the past, which of them are still relevant in the present. Australia, has a lot to be proud of in its social policy, an immense amount to be proud of in its social policy. We shouldn't be ashamed of what we've achieved. We have, I think, still a relatively generous welfare state, certainly by many standards. Many of us would like it to be much more generous than it is. And, one of the things that this crisis has exposed are things that, some of those weaknesses we've known about for a very long time, the outrageously low benefit provide to unemployed people, for instance. But, you know, there's also a lot in our past to be proud of. And one of the reasons we've gotten through this crisis with relatively few fatalities is we have a functioning public health system. We have a health system that is a hell of a lot better, for instance, than that of the United States. We have a health system that hasn't been starved in the way that the British one has been over the last decade through a long period of austerity. And that's something, you know, that we can look at and you know, I think, you know, perhaps find in those kinds of public policy achievements, you know, some sort of inspiration as we go forward.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think, although I frankly didn't quite spell it out, there's a lot of historical contingency in the way things develop, which means it's difficult to import a completely foreign model and graft it on. You have to start from your own history. And the other problem is that neoliberalism has been resurgent everywhere. So that at one time in the past, we might have said, let's look at Sweden or Norway, and in some ways they're good, certainly not in terms of pandemic policy in Sweden, but because they've been subject to this winding back, I think that's looking at other countries in the recent past is not helpful. On the other hand, I think, you know, this pandemic is 20, 30 different national experiments which are going to tell us a lot. And I think already an obvious point here, which has been reinforced more and more since the global financial crisis, is I doubt that you'll get anybody in public politics to say, well, we should be more like America. And yet the policies that the government is pursuing are policies that would make us more like America. I think similarly, you know, the story, the austerity story about the national health system, I think is coming through. So I think we'll see both a very negative assessment of the way in which some other countries like the UK and the USA have performed, and we'll see lots of experiments in different things. I mean, the Spanish government is talking about a genuine universal basic income. That is, well, when I say genuine, what I mean is not merely a small pilot program, but something which would actually be a public policy rather than a pilot. It doesn't meet some people's purity tests, I suspect, in terms of what policy it is, but it's they're no longer talking about this as we might think about this. It's, yeah, we're actually going to do it, and that's something very different from what we had in the past. I think we'll see as countries try and get out of the crisis, we're going to get lots of experimentation in things, some of which will turn out to be models, particular ideas we can adopt without trying to fully implement an overseas model.
Thanks very much. Now, a couple of people have asked questions about China and our relationship to China and the relevance of that. And I'd like to invite Janet Angel to ask a question. Janet Angel. Janet Angel there?
Yep.
I'm not sure you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you, Janet.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Well, I just think that there's going to be a lot of economic changes, and it sounds like we might be in a bit of trouble. You know, if our saviour from the last, you know,
Can you speak up? We can't quite hear you. Speak into your microphone.
I'll do my best. There's something wrong with my microphone. Yeah. Anyway, so because of the China, it got us out of the last recession. But if we use that trading boost, will we have the money or the wherewithal to even contemplate paying back the stuff that we, you know, get our economic recovery going at all?
I suppose at this stage, I'm much more concerned about the US than about China. I mean, China, yeah, there's going to be a global recession, and we're seeing, Chinese consumers aren't buying and things are going more slowly. And there's all sorts of other problematic stuff about China. They're building coal-fired power stations as a stimulus. Of course, they're having suddenly had their main rival pretty much disappear from the the scene in terms of any kind of international influence. They're throwing their weight around in exactly the same way as the US used to, and we're seeing that. But I think we'll have a general economic problem with the world economy. I think on the whole, I'd rather be exporting to China right now than I think China's problem in many ways with the difficulty of selling something. So I think that's where the recovery is going to be most problematic.
Yeah. Nothing to add to that. That's fine.
Right. So I think we've dealt with most of the things. I think there's one or two more themes that we can just like to raise. So Jodie Reynolds had a question about the sort of relative rewards that the different people in our society receive, and whether we might be seeing, or we ought to be seeing that changing. Would you like to ask your question, Jodie?
Hey, hi everybody. Fantastic discussion. Thanks very much for all your input, and thanks to the speakers. Wages have not risen in decades. This is, our economy going into this crisis had many areas that sort of could be improved upon, and socialism seems to have come to the rescue, funnily enough, when we needed it. But coming out of this, talking about the recovery, can we increase wages for those people? Is that a feasible thing to be doing when we're coming out of a COVID crisis like this?
Well, certainly, I think, resources have to come from somewhere. So if wages increase for low-paid workers, that's going to mean less income in one form or another for other people. But given the rise in top incomes, I don't see that as a big problem. Indeed, the simplest policy, and one which, despite the government's rhetoric, I still expect, is that the big tax cuts have been legislated into place for 2024-25 will be deferred once they start appearing in the forward estimate. At the moment, they don't appear in the government's budget because they're so far in the future. They don't have to account for them. I think they're going to look like a gigantic hole once they appear, especially if the government goes ahead with company tax cuts, which are also locked in. So I think there's no doubt that it can be done. And I think the political climate for large groups of workers has never been more favourable. That is, if the kind of thing which socialists have been saying for ages of how can it be that a merchant banker is worth 20 times a nurse, we've been saying that for a long time, but I think it has a lot more resonance now than it did. And furthermore, of course, the general breakdown in belief that, well, we've got the market and the market decides stuff and the market is good. Again, I don't think even people in the government say that with a straight face anymore. So the chance for it, the feasibility is there. The political climate has never been more favourable, but of course that doesn't mean that the heads of the great banks are going to say, look, we've decided to take a 20% pay cut and send it to the nurses' union to distribute. They have to be, it has to be fought for. But I think the opportunities are there in a way they haven't been for a very long time.
Yeah, I'm probably a bit less optimistic. I worry about the talk of industrial relations reform coming out of this, which we know what that means. It doesn't mean bestowing more power on unions. It basically means making life even harder. I think there will be, there'll be an impulse coming out of all this toward austerity, towards deregulation, towards further labour market deregulation. That's going to have to be resisted. It's all guesswork at this stage. But the reality is, we have an industrial relations system in this country that makes life very, very difficult for unions. And it's not the only reason, of course, for wage stagnation, but it's a contributor, as I understand. My economist friends tell me it is something that contributes to that stagnation, and that means that we need to look askance at some of the stuff that's, I think, already coming from the Murdoch press, And, you know, we may well find that coming from members of the government before terribly long, again, as those familiar patterns of politics resume. And you know, industrial relations reform, as it's always called, is never far from the agenda with coalition governments.
Yeah, to restate, well, I mean, an important observation is this is a fight that's going to come on very soon, because there's legislation actually there in the queue that the government has to decide whether to proceed with or not. And in that sense, I think the timing for them is bad. That, you know, overall, to talk about industrial relations reform, and as long as you say it quickly, it's just the usual stuff. To say right in the middle of this national crisis, when we're all pulling together, we're going to push this piece of legislation through, I think will be very difficult for them. And if they pull it, if they defer it, I think you know, that's a win in itself, and will make it much more difficult for them to push it. So that's not automatic, but I think it simply says, again, that the chance to pick a fight on the right terrain on this has been given to us. That the view that we shouldn't do this at a time of crisis is important. And the other point I think that needs to be made is when we look at the question, well, what has this industrial relations reform done in terms of making the economy better prepared for a crisis like this? The answer is nothing good, only harmful stuff. That if we had an economy where everybody had a job which was either permanent full-time or permanent part-time, the issue of, well, how can we keep people in those jobs would be massively more straightforward than when you have vast numbers of people who are supposedly independent contractors or casual employees, or all of the things that reform has been promoting. So I think that how far that recognition is sunk in isn't clear, but I certainly think this is the first fight that's going to come up, and it's certainly one that's fighting to win.
Thanks very much. Now, I think Santino, who has been working away behind the scenes supporting this Q&A session, has a question of his own. Is that right, Santino, that you would like to ask something?
Yeah, if that's all right.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
It's unnerving to unmute myself. So I suppose my question is, it kind of strikes the heart of kind of all the things we've been discussing with respect to the COVID crisis and the rise of socialism and so forth. This crisis has revealed that big businesses, when things go very south, they seek to kind of collectivize the losses. That is, workers have to weather some of the loss, the government has to weather some of the loss, taxpayers, obviously depending on your interpretation of where the money is coming from, have to foot the cost. But in the good times, businesses are able to privatize the profits. Is there necessary to kind of reevaluate the way our economy is structured, in particular the role that workers have in their workplace and the way that profits operate in kind of general businesses? I know we've talked quite broadly about that it's necessary to strike a better balance and that unions lack a lot of power in modern society. I'd like to hear maybe a bit more specifically about some of the things that can practically be accomplished maybe in the next couple of years, or if a progressive government was elected in Australia.
Do you want to start, Frank?
So I guess you're asking. Are you asking partly there about sort of workers' role in terms of? I mean, was it a question partly about industrial democracy, about the role that employees play in that kind of context?
Yeah, certainly.
In terms of decision making in their workplaces. Yeah. Look, I think one of the really interesting things we've seen in this crisis is simply the way in which we do work has drastically, I mean, for many people at any rate, those who are still in jobs, has changed dramatically. The kinds of technologies we're using tonight are being very widely deployed, and many workplaces have, I guess, their dependence on the capacities of their workforces. Of course, the facilities their workers are able to provide from their homes in many instances, but certainly a dependence, I suppose, on the autonomy of their workers has been underlined during this crisis. And I think that will, you know, potentially affect the ways in which we go back to work. You know, are we simply going to go back into our offices, onto our shop floors in the same ways that we did in the past? I think it's very unlikely. I mean, already within my own workplace, the university, it's pretty clear that we're not going to be teaching, for instance, in the same way as we did before. I mean, the point that John made right at the beginning about, you know, can you imagine in the future flying people all over the country for things that can be just as readily done using these technologies? And I think that will probably affect the ways in which, you know, businesses and workers relate to one another, you know, in the space of the workplace. In fact, the space itself is being radically redefined as we speak. So I think there could be some really interesting things about, you know, all those old concepts of worker management and industrial democracy that we perhaps hear too little of. We could well be revisiting some of those issues in the time ahead.
Yeah, I mean, maybe a very general point about this. I mean, going before this crisis, I talked a lot about automation, will robots take jobs, and this kind of thing. And a point I've made all the time is it's not robots taking, yeah, this has come up time and time again. If robots were going to take jobs, they would have taken them all in some sense. But what you see is robots, to use a shorthand, disrupt things. When things are disrupted, the party that's more powerful benefits. Robots disrupt industries. If those industries depend on award wages, the award wages are upset. And until the crisis, it was pretty clear which direction this was all going in. That is in the direction of the gig economy, more powerful bosses and so forth. I think in this situation where business is suddenly dependent on government and where government needs to maintain a degree of popular goodwill, the chance to exploit changes in working conditions, changes in the process of work in ways that are positive for working conditions, I think is really potentially there. I mean, again, of course, a side of struggle, but I think on much more favourable terrain than we would have if we were talking about what happens when remote work becomes possible 6 months ago. The answer would have been employ spy cameras in every room in the house, and yet more control from the employer. I think an obvious part of the narrative is about remote work, for example. In general, the people most opposed to have been bosses because they want to keep people under their eye, and the job can't be done unless we're all in there with the bosses looking over our shoulder. A reasonable question is, well, they aren't doing it, and the work seems to be getting done. Yeah, and maybe the economy doesn't need quite so many bosses.
Thanks very much for those answers. And I think I might take one more, which maybe will be the last question. And there have been a few questions about the impact of the COVID-19 situation on the global economy and globalization, and there have been questions about globalization generally. So I'd like to invite Anne-Marie Newton to ask a question. Anne-Marie Newton.
Yes, good evening. I think it's, I was just writing a reply to somebody. I think it's very important that we, in order to survive from an economic point of view and to move forward once we go past COVID, is to come back to what made countries like Australia extremely wealthy. And one of those things is the abundance of our own natural resources. We must save time in how we manufacture things instead of shipping those manufacturing aspects overseas and outsource, bring it back to Australia. We must look at saving time in transporting by having it back in Australia. We must save in quality of production by using our own natural goods, where we can produce and make far better standard of quality because we're producing from our own natural raw products. And these are the sorts of things that political parties from both sides have thrown the baby with the bathwater out, if you like, because what they've endeavoured to do is reduce costs primarily by sacrificing workers, because they've seen workers as the largest commodity. We need to change that thinking and make workers as the investment. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Thanks. Who's going to answer first?
John, or?
Well, I think the broader issue is clearly in important respects the economy policy globally took a wrong turn after the crisis of the 1970s. On the other hand, we can't return to the economy of the 1970s. Globally, not just in countries like Australia and the US, but globally, manufacturing is a smaller part of the world economy than it's been at any time, probably since the middle of the 20th century. Probably since early in the 20th century, reached its peak in the mid 20th century. So the idea that we can return usefully, in any sense, to the days when most of the physical objects in your house were made in Australia, I think, isn't going to happen, and if it did, would not create large numbers of jobs. That said, I think the crisis exposed all sorts of weaknesses in the cut to the bone efficiency of just-in-time processes, production chains designed to drive intensive work down to the lowest wage possible, and so forth. So I think we're going to see a radical change in the kind of globalisation we have, but what comes out of it won't be anything like what we went into it with in the 1960s and 1970s.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'd add, I suppose, to that really is, the crisis has also exposed, I suppose, the fragility of an export strategy that, obviously depends really substantially on services. And that aspect of globalisation that I suppose really took off in the 1980s, really. I mean, the market to international students was essentially a product of the mid-80s, decisions by John Dawkins as Trade Minister, actually, and also the growing role of tourism and so on. The crisis has exposed that is a very vulnerable kind of market to international disruption. I mean, in universities, it's been widely known for some time that this was, that very heavy dependence on international students, and particularly, I think, in the international students, when you're basically looking at just one or two source markets, is dangerous stuff, and the full dangers of that are now coming into their own. And undoubtedly, there are a lot of institutions and businesses out there that are going to have to really recast their operations around these kinds of frailties that have been shown up in the crisis that we're going through.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks very much to John and Frank, and to our audience for a really fascinating discussion and really fascinating insights. I think it's been quite a privilege for us to hear the thoughts of two such knowledgeable and such deep thinkers on where we are today and where we might go forward from here. I'll close the Q&A there. Just to note that videos of the events in the series and of this event as well will be, or the other events are on our website. This one will be, and also on Facebook. If you missed some of the earlier ones, you can catch up that way. So I'd like to well, first of all, just to say that if you asked a question and through the chat and so on, and it didn't make it to our speakers, I'm sorry. It's we've done our best to pick out the themes and so on that were coming from the audience. So I'd now like to hand over to Julia Thornton to take us on from here. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, I personally found that fantastically interesting, and I was really particularly interested in the contrast between the two speakers in where they were looking for change. I think John was more looking at the change that was kind of happening at the sort of the grassroots, and Frank was looking at the changes that are happening in government. And I think the conflict between those two sets of changes is actually going to be one of the more interesting things. I think government's learning completely different things from what the population at large is learning, and I don't think the two mindsets have clashed yet. I'm sure they will. I would like to reiterate Jeff's thank you to both speakers. I thought that was really, really absorbing speech and question time from both of you, and I think we're going to hear more about this particular Zoom session for a while to come. And I'd also like to thank the audience. I'm reading the chat. It was absolutely fascinating. There's some very intelligent questions going on out there. And I think if Max Dumais is hanging around anywhere on this, I think he's in this Zoom somewhere, he's very keen on collecting the chat questions and making something out of them for Fabians, turning them into a kind of a report. And the last one, actually, we had a Zoom recently with Andrew Lee, and he collated everything together and sent it to Andrew. So that was quite an interesting use of the chat function in Zoom. But I'm sure we can do something similar with the chat here and turn it into something that sort of has a bit of extra life. So if you didn't get a question in, don't despair. Your commentary will be noted one way or another. I'm just doing the sort of, I suppose, a little bit of kind of finishing off here. We're a newly elected board as of about, what was it, about 5:30, I think. We were a newly elected board. So I'm a new old chair. And we've got a couple of completely new board members as well as many continuing people. So we have not yet put into place our next year of events. We've got a few ideas cooking, but I haven't got. Race Matthews invariably, when he was chair, used to do an ad. Wherever he was, he would do an ad for the next event in Fabians, and I can't do that, and I feel I'm letting them down. So, but we will have stuff out to you fairly soon as the new board gets up and running and active. I've said earlier, feel free to make a donation. We never say no to small amounts of money, especially if lots of people are doing it, and that keeps us free and independent, and that's terrific. Also consider membership of Fabians if you're not currently a member, because that will then give you access to the events, and we are slowly and steadily starting to build on our website areas which will be just available to members as well as the kind of general public ones.